get that out of the way.
And yeah, get on the screen there.
Okay, thanks. All right. Sorry for the delay there.
Looks like the Serengeti.
It's actually not really Satis. I took a picture of. There's some wildebeest just off to the left. No, this is what Satis Creek looks like in the summertime. And so we'll be down there. I work for the Yakama Nation. I'm a fish biologist with them, and I work pretty much on reservation on Satis, Topnish, and Tanum creeks, which are the lower three tributaries of the Yakama Basin. And they get progressively hotter and drier as you move south. And Satis really is a true desert, very akin to being at Hanford sometimes. And so when we're talking about a riparian assessment, I've been trying to get this funded for 3 years now. Can't quite match 11 years as Mitch has been working, but a long time. Because in this desert setting, as you can see, the only trees are supported by groundwater from the creek itself. And so you can imagine that in that condition, steelhead bearing stream really requires those riparian trees, that riparian ecosystem in the desert to be as good a health as possible in order to provide the best fish habitat possible. I always go back to this one just to, is there a way to get it off the bottom there, Michael?
I'm not sure. See, I see what you're saying though.
It's not totally critical.
I'm not sure it's doing that.
Okay, well, I'll just let it be. You can see the Yakama Reservation, the ceded area, and actually, just out of curiosity, how many people know what that means, technically, the ceded territories? Raise your hand. I know more than.
Yeah, I do, because that was my slide.
It's not supposed to, yeah, so it was during the treaty in 1855, which was not exactly a voluntary thing on the part of tribal members, but it was, it happened. And in that big dealing, the tribe ceded or conceded about 10 million acres of what's now Washington State. And the land was given over, however, the tribe reserved rights. Tribal people reserved, including fishing, hunting, harvest, interestingly, grazing cattle too. That was already a thing. And so these rights are incredibly important to the tribe, as well as the area I didn't even show here, which is the usual and custom places which span far down into Oregon and beyond, and to the west, to the east to Yellowstone. Is a much bigger area. But this is really the heart of Yakama territory, and these treaty rights are very important. It's one of the reasons Mitch can bring up what he's talking about in the upper Yakama and as far up to Wenatchee and beyond there too. So the reservation itself was reserved for tribal people, about 1.4 million acres, and you can see it's in the lower part of the Yakama Basin. This is a very Washington-centric view of Mid-Columbia steelhead territory. I kind of wanted to situate you into the Yakama Basin. You can see we have the major populations in the Yakama Basin of Mid-Columbia. ESA threatens steelhead, the upper Yakama there, the Natchez River, Topnish Creek, and Satis Creek. So this is in the recovery planning, you'll see Satis Creek listed as a separate population. Zooming into Satis Creek itself, this is Satis Creek, blown out a little bit there in the pale. You can see Satis Creek beside Highway 97. Dry Creek, Logie Creek, and Mule Dry Creek, which is a tiny little arid watershed. They all support steelhead. Satis Creek has the greatest number. Satis Creek main stem itself, the basin's about 500 square miles. It's quite large. In the headwaters, it's forested. Logie Creek is spring fed. It's a very important stream out of the Simcoe volcanic formations. It's very porous. It captures snowmelt. And then that red sort of stripe along the stream itself, the highway beside Highway 97 is the project area. It's about 35 river miles and about 2,000 acres of floodplain. And it stretches from the very lowest, hottest desert into the very beginnings of the agricultural area there on the upper right of your screen and all the way up towards Satis Pass on the lower left. When you drive beside Highway 97, you're seeing this pretty readily, what the landscape looks like. It's very dry, some cattle, some horses, and a lot of little canyons that are intermittent. One thing I want you, if nothing else, to walk away from this presentation with is the disproportionate importance of Satis Creek to Yakama Basin steelhead populations if all recovery goals were hit, it would be important. As it stands now, it's even more important. So even though it's about, let's just say, 10% of the critical habitat miles in critical habitat listed by NOAA, about 0.8% ITRC area, intrinsic potential area. Currently, you can see that graph on the right, the blue columns. It has supported over the last 20, 30 years, a quarter to a third of the entire run for the Yakama Basin. So when we're talking about conserving and restoring steelhead in the Yakama Basin, we have to focus on Satis Creek, among other important areas, but it is one of the very most important areas for steelhead. So it's very fitting that the board focused their attention on it, in my mind. Unfortunately, just like everywhere else with Mid-Columbia steelhead, the counts are going down, whether you're talking about red counts, whether you're talking about escapement. Normally, if you look at the geomean over the last 10 years, the annual fish count's about 930, but that's inflated by those high years you see in like even around 2015. And if you, the actual state numbers I have in 2019, Alex, I don't know if you have any more recent ones, the SP count, but they're lower, so it's probably 300 to 500 fish now every year, which is still a significant proportion of the Yakama Basin population. Some of the other advantages of working in Satis Creek, it's almost all under tribal control as a natural flow regime. So there's a high restoration potential. And also the program I work in and direct, Yakama Reservation Watersheds program, is a management and stewardship program. So we don't do restoration projects and walk away. We, because we're on the reservation, are there for the long haul. So whatever we do, we're able to go back to, tweak, observe, and do more if necessary. Something people in this room probably do know about, but it doesn't hurt to touch on it, especially in a desert. The riparian system is important to fish, up in Gold Creek too. You can just go, I really took this straight from the priority habitat manuals that PFW's put out, which are very good on the benefits of riparian systems. They're put out in 2020. So they mentioned channel morphology. And in this case, it provides in a place where without vegetation, you would get a desert wash kind of situation with multiple threaded channels, very low stream flows, very high propensity to sink in and you go intermittent. You get a single channel with stable banks. Almost all large in-stream wood comes from the riparian zone, especially in desert systems. It can reduce stream temperature through shade, reduces pollutants. And then the food web aspect is often ignored, but that's highly important. Again, if you just have bushes beside your creek, you're gonna get a lot fewer insects falling in, a lot fewer leaves than you do with a healthy riparian system. And there's been recent modeling. This number 6 comes from the Chehalis Basin. That's that lowest reference on the bottom from Fogel et al. They show, modelers always overinflate the certainty of their work. However, the modeling does suggest that through reducing stream temperature from the current situation, which is already degraded almost everywhere through riparian impacts, and also through future revegetation that buffers future warming, it can actually produce increased fish productivity. In this case, I think they were looking at Chinook and steelhead, but that paper is interesting if you want to look at it. There's been a ton of modeling happening right now in the Chehalis Basin. So we can take that we have a really important place for steelhead in the basin, and then I think we can all accept that the riparian system itself is critical to the health of fish populations everywhere, and including Satis Creek. On Satis Creek, we have, in 1996 is when the program I work in started, roughly, a guy named Tom McCoy, and they did a Satis watershed analysis, which is a very large scale, rough look at the watershed. And one of the things they had a woman working at the program at the time called Kay Gellenbeck, and she got really interested in the riparian system, and she did her thesis on it at Central Washington. And so this is a table 12 from her thesis, which is available. I can send it to you if you want. And it was a comparison between, she took advantage of the fact that there were aerial photos from 1949. And then when she was working in the mid-90s, she used the most recent USGS black and whites, which are 95 and 96. And she just compared, she did aerial photo interpretation, and got out on the ground and compared a lot of things, but among them, the mature or the dominant tree canopy cover. And it's a little hard to read, I apologize, but if you just go across the columns, you have young trees or young types of growth, and among them prominently are aspen and cottonwood. I want you to look at those. So you have young in alder, excuse me, not aspen, but alder. You have young alder in 95, 10.3 acres. Cottonwood had 0. You have mature, you have alder, 1 acre and about 17 acres of mature cottonwoods. And if you look at the bottom column, the total, the cover was less in 95 than in 49 in both cases. And then finally you get to the decadent column, you have 16 acres of decadent cottonwoods, none of alder, Then there's an undetermined, but that story of decreasing cover, that's the primary story in her study reaches, which overlap with our project reach, not good. And then you also have a real change in dominance from black cottonwood to white alder. This is not red alder, this is white alder, Alnus rhombifolius. And that is significant. I'll go into that a little more in detail later on in the presentation, but that is something so she stopped her study in 95, and when we go out on the landscape, we see that same thing, and we see it probably at a more progressed stage than she saw it in 95. We see reduced cover, decadent stands of cottonwood, and alder everywhere. Just to illustrate, we have stacked images here, 49, 96, and 2020, of an area in the study area, in the assessment area. You can see where that red arrow is. In 49, there's a dense cover, and if you zoom in, believe it or not, you can distinguish alder from cottonwood because the canopy of cottonwoods is a lot rougher in texture. Alder tends to be very smooth and linear. You can see that dense area stretching from just to the right of the red arrow onto the left of the picture. If you go down to 49, it's really decreased. If you go down to 2020, it hasn't increased. If anything, it's decreased even more. And then you can't really see it, but if you really look closely at the 2020 one, if you have good eyes, like the gentleman sitting here, you might be able to see linear growths along the channel to the left of that red area. Those are white alder coming in. Those are white, and that's what they do. Anywhere alder grow, they line the channels. I've seen papers about this in Italy. The reason is because they drop their seeds in the fall, and then when the spring high water comes, they're heavy. They're not floaters. The seeds are heavy. They get deposited right on stream banks. So that's why they do that. But you can see this section is just one section of 35 stream miles for sure. I think this is about 5 stream miles or 4 stream miles. But this is illustrative of what's happened in a lot of the area. So it aligns with what Katie Kellenbeck reported in her work. We see it on the ground. Just some pictures on the ground, things, what they look like in a very tiny portion. There's fires happen, and there's the remnants in 2007, that fire happened right beside Highway 97. You have stands of these raggedy old dying legacy cottonwoods with alder beside them. On the lower left, you have there's our crew in Satis Creek doing part of the assessment, stream habitat assessment. And you see alders lining that stream, and what you don't see is what they do then, they tend to catch the first wave of sediment coming off in floods. They catch it, it makes a berm, and it tends to lock the stream in. Their roots form kind of walls, and so I don't know if it's natural or unnatural, but the stream definitely seems to get locked, and it reduces lateral mobility, which in turn reduces sediment recruitment, which in turn reduces rejuvenation of spawning gravels. We've noticed that. We don't have any data right now to back that up, but that's definitely something we've noticed. And then finally, on the lower right, just the size of the cottonwood compared to white alders is quite significant. It's quite significantly bigger. They grow longer. They're just a bigger chunk of vegetation to fall in the stream, so they're quite different. We have excellent spawning data. Satis Creek, I would say, is probably the easiest stream to survey for reds in the basin because it's very dry. The water comes off early and fast most years. This year is kind of an exception. And so we can actually get in there under good observation conditions to record reds. Everyone knows red counts are always just like a relative index. You miss them, high water, you can't see them because it's too cloudy, but Satis Creek is probably the best of all possible situations for counting reds. So we have records going back 22 years now. And you can see that red in the top image, the red polygon is the project area, and all those black dots are spawning red locations from the last 20 years. So you can see everywhere except for the lowest 8 miles on the right, which is highly agricultural, very degraded floodplain part of the stream. There's spawning and there's rearing. And then if you zoom in and jump down to the second panel, you can see that the green is the riparian, the black dots are the reds that we've observed. They tend not to be in the areas that are bare. And this is probably not rocket science, and it's probably not surprising, but it's important, again, to focus the mind on that link between the riparian system and actual fish spawning and productivity, which we see in Satis Creek and happens elsewhere. Where you don't have strong riparian, you really don't have strong spawning. Ergo, if you reduce the riparian further, you would probably lose reds every year. So we really are worried about this situation with loss of cover and loss of cottonwoods. It directly affects the productivity of the fish, we think. By training, I'm a plant ecologist, which is why I like tables like this. I've talked about white alder and black cottonwood. There is a big difference. They're different species for one thing, but black cottonwood is much bigger in diameter and in height. It lives longer, and significantly, and so when it falls in the stream, it's a bigger chunk of wood. Another thing that's really of import here, this is, as I said, in the desert, it's beside a major highway, so fires are super frequent in this system. When white alder burns, it doesn't come back. So if you get a system dominated by white alder in a place with a lot of wildfires, you can think ahead 30 years and see a future that's not very good for riparian. And this has actually happened in that lower agricultural floodplain. I've seen places where alder is burned and nothing was back but weeds. And so you have to go in and actively revegetate if you want to restore that. On the other hand, black cottonwood very often resprouts vigorously from fires. It's very closely related to aspen. And so if you have a system with a lot of black cottonwood in it, it's resilient to fire in a way that alder is not. So one of the reasons why we're worried about this shift in species dominance. One of the things, we have this 1996 watershed analysis, which is very general. In general, along with, some of you may remember I've shown this slide before when I was asking for money for riparian wood projects. You know, we have a lot of hypotheses why things have gone downhill on Satis Creek. It is a natural watershed. It doesn't have a lot of development. So what's going on there to cause this degradation of channel and riparian zone? Well, you know, like a lot of places, it had a lot of things in the distant past and the recent past that have affected it that are legacy disturbances. Beaver trapping, heavy sheep and cattle grazing, that's for sure in this rangeland system. In the 90s, started timber harvests up in the headwaters, probably affected stream flow to some extent. And then the actual middle portion of Satis Creek where this project is was actively diverted into a lot of smallholding agriculture in the middle part of the 20th century. Fortunately, the tribe bought all the water rights in the 1990s, and so now it's natural flow. But that, you know, having a stream unnaturally go dry through the growing season is not a good thing for vegetation. Planting cottonwoods. The other thing that probably plays a key role here in channel degradation, which in some places seems very associated with kind of dropping the water table out off the bottom, which affects riparian systems. Very large floods in 74 and 1996. Satis Creek normally floods about 1,000 CFS. In 1994, 1974, the USGS estimated the flood at 33,000 CFS. That's a good sized flood on the main stem of the Yakama River, much less a tiny thing like Satis Creek, which normally in the summer is flowing about 20 CFS. So it probably blew it out. So if you can imagine a time when vegetation had been weakened by years of irrigation diversions and a massive flood in 74, massive flood in 96 comes through, it's pretty easy to imagine an unraveling of the system. The 2000s, we have more pressure from grazing. There's a feral horse population that's a big issue, more cattle grazing, not so much sheep, and then the dominance of alders in the riparian. So we have kind of listed our thoughts, just went through them. Hopefully in an assessment like this, one of our goals is to tease these out and figure out which ones are the real drivers of what's going on. You're probably wondering when I was going to get to this part. It's a pretty simple idea. We have identified a degradation, a loss of cover, a loss of cottonwoods. We want to find out why, and we want to find out why in a way that can inform management actions. So very specifically, we want to describe the condition of the riparian ecosystem. What's it like now? And we do that through sampling using remote sensing, which is cheap and fast for a larger scale view. And then we're going to have people getting out in the field and doing transects and collecting vegetation data, composition and size, and species composition and size, tree coring to determine age structures, which are very important in trees, just as in fish. And then you can see some metrics there that are likely that we would want to collect. And we're going to use that data to identify causes and drivers of riparian degradation. For example, if we find that heavy grazing intensity is correlated with a lack of cottonwoods by reach, well, that's a pretty strong clue. Actually, when you go out there, you don't see a lot of heavy grazing right along the creek so much, so I'm guessing that's not the case, but we'll see what we find. If you simply find that alders have stabilized the system in response to these past disturbances, maybe that's another thing. Maybe we start dropping alders in the stream and create a little gravel movement, which cottonwoods need to establish. So basically, this really will lead directly to projects to rejuvenate and restore the riparian system. And then the bottom line there is develop restoration approaches and strategies to address causes. And we want to maintain or increase this current riparian cover over time. And I don't even put the main goal of our program, of course, is to restore fish for the utilization by Yakama people. That's what we're about. It aligns, this project aligns with Steelhead recovery plan pretty nicely. One of the limiting factors was degraded riparian area and large woody debris recruitment. And the recovery strategies are continue ongoing efforts by the Yakama Nation to improve watershed and riparian conditions within the Satis drainage. These are quotes from the recovery plan. I always like to, make sure we're paying attention to which part of the fish, especially the steelhead life cycle we're talking about. And this is mostly targeted at spawning and rearing habitat, shade, spawning gravels. And you saw the picture there where there's very little spawning in areas of lack riparian. So we're looking squarely at that. We have another ongoing, actually initiating This year, we hope a study to look at smolt survival in the same system. So that's a separate thing. But right, this project itself, eventually we hope will benefit production and rearing. If we're fortunate enough to be successful, we would, it takes a while to get the money in place, always. It's always kind of an antsy time, but once it's in place, we would hope, sometime in the spring of 24, we can start moving, get a contract. This will be done through a contract. Select a consultant, probably two years of field campaigns, and by December 2025, closing out with a report that will list exactly sort of what I stepped through with those goals: condition, analysis of causes of riparian degradation on a by reach basis, and approaches and strategies recommended for restoration actions and management actions. Cost estimate, we think about 250,000 will work. It's scalable. If by the time, if we get the money and it's not enough to cover that entire reach, it's a scalable thing. You can look at the most important reaches. We would provide about 50,000 from Bonneville Power as a match, and we're requesting 200,000 from you guys, which I realize is the entire assessment amount. If you don't ask, you're never going to receive. So that's our request. Potential constraints for an assessment study like this with very little ground disturbance is probably not too much of a permitting issue. There's always the physical factor of field work, floods, there are fires. Those things could delay the project but not prevent it. And administrative constraints always delay things. So far, they have not prevented projects. It's very frustrating, but we get through it. And with that, I'll be happy to take any questions you might have. Yeah, when did we take that?
I know fire a few years ago really hit pretty hard in that area.
Many fires have happened there since I've worked for the tribe since 2005, and there have been 10. The entire sort of drainage area of the UC driving up the highway has burned multiple times. Wherever you see sagebrush, it hasn't burned.
Right.
Because it got the double whammy of grazing to knock out the bunch grasses and then fire to knock out the sagebrush, and you're left with cheatgrass.
Talking about just right in the creek in the flat, just past where you just did that new bridge, or the
Yeah,
county did that new bridge there for about a mile and
that was the 2007 picture.
a half. Right. Really got nailed.
But there's aspen and cottonwood in there, and they're coming back, which is a good thing.
Is there anything other than those two trees, if you're looking at any other choice that might be large but more fire resistant?
Well, it changes as you go up the reach. In the lowest parts, it's too hot and dry for anything but those two trees. It's 6 to 7 inches of rain a year. Pines come in as you go up Highway 97. We would plant pines, but pines are never going to be probably a dominant part of that system. You also get into oaks. Yeah, so as you move, what's that?
Yeah, there's a lot of oak.
Yeah, you get into oak systems. They tend to be set back and not right on the stream, though. They're not truly a riparian tree, and so they're not going to be the major things that are shading the stream and providing large wood inputs in our experience. The pine can grow quite close, can tolerate, having wet roots sometimes. So we would definitely put pine in. And just as importantly for us, any revegetation action would include culturally important species like chokecherry, currant bushes like currant, and other things. But if you're looking at dominant trees for shade, it's probably alder and cottonwood with some pine. And oak fir as you get up higher. But really, this is all about the sub 20-inch rain, 20 inches a year, which results in no trees in the hills and trees restricted to the riparian zone.
You lose much of your alder or cottonwood to beavers?
They don't really like alder as much as they like willows, cottonwoods, and aspen. Of course, there are beavers in here. There's a really wonderful place on Logie Creek, right as it comes into Satis. It's called the Swamps, because beavers are, and that place is really, that's transformative to see that place, because every type of riparian trees there. We have water birch, alder, aspen, cottonwood, willows, all. And so, yeah, and it's just, we hope they do. We hope they eat them, and any project we would ever do, we would do that with beavers in mind.
So are you looking to encourage beaver activity as a way of bringing back the trees and the
We currently are doing that. We work closely with our wildlife program, and they, on and off through years and more or less organized, they have constantly been dropping beavers in there. WashDOT takes beavers to that area. There are places where they have taken and places where they have not. In the phases where they've had more funding, they've been able to do family translocations. We lost the spillways in the hatchery recently to keep the families where if you want to do beaver family mode, you got to have a place to put them. They lost that place, so now it's just dropping single beavers into places that already have beavers, so it's a little better chance. You know, even in the best run beaver programs, it's like 30% of your places catch, right? Otherwise, bad things happen to beavers or they move somewhere else. So I will say that, you know, if you think about beavers, talked a lot about this with Alex and with others, you know, because I was fortunate enough to work in a wildlife program when I first came to the Yakama Nation. One of the very important things about beaver, in my mind, is knowing where they already are. They're thick in this basin and they're thick in the valley of the Yakama Reservation. There's so many beavers. And so it's not so much a shortage of beavers, it's probably degraded systems that can't support them where you don't have them. So we're probably more interested in this case in building the things that beavers need and letting them recolonize naturally because they're in the system.
You haven't really mentioned willows, and yet this is one of those systems with a lot of fire historically too. I wouldn't be surprised if lots of willow things around the cottonwood stands and whatnot. What's your sense of where?
I think the hydrology varies. One thing yeah, of course they're willows and of course they're important. They're not the big dominant shade tree that cottonwoods are. One thing that's interesting about Satis Creek, let me see if I can go back. Okay, so you see the big blob on the far upper right. That's big floodplain that was as degraded as it gets. The farmer there used to take two big cats and a big chain and a big steel ball, which is still, you can see off the bridge at Plank Road. It's this big concrete ball encased in steel. He would literally drag it right down the stream. To be clear, you know, and he had some berms and illegal irrigation set up there. So that floodplain is totally hosed and the creek is trying to rebuild an inset floodplain. That's a really messed up area that is going to take heavy duty restoration if we ever get to it, but it's also out of the spawning zone, at least now. It's probably an important wintering area. As you come upstream, you go past Dry Creek, and then you get to Logie. Remember I said Logie was spring fed. So that's a really important transition zone where Logie comes in there. It provides about 20 CFS even in the summer, cold water. So that wood project I mentioned, we've been fortunate enough to find either $750,000 or $1 million to do that in that region. We're doing it there because it's perennial water. Then you come upstream from Logie Creek, and that part of Satis Creek gets highly intermittent. In dry years, it goes totally dry, totally goes underground. And in that area, Alex, there are a lot of willows. And you know, if it's a place like that, then naturally, when dry, we're not going to expect thriving cottonwood stands necessarily. Although once started, you know, cottonwoods can tolerate, as long as the water table doesn't drop off from under, and they can, as long as it's within 1.5 meters or so, 2 meters, they can access that water. So you don't really know what happened there. Is it natural? Is it legacy disturbance? And then as you move upstream past those intermittent zones, when you do get into the pine and the oaks, and even farther up, a little bit of Doug fir. Willows are important every step of the way. One of the things in that Gellenbeck thesis that we also see is a slow drying. You saw areas of mesic shrub, which you can see on aerial photos are just dark, go to xeric shrub, and that would affect willows. So it's not that willows aren't important. They're incredibly important beaver food, incredibly important to the food web. We don't mention migratory songbirds and all the wildlife that use these corridors too, which are equally important. However, they're not big enough really to provide in-stream structure or to provide as much shade as a healthy cottonwood or even white alder stand would be. But good point.
Are you employing LiDAR as part of this assessment?
We have excellent LiDAR, fortunately, already. I would expect the remote sensing part of the assessment, I would ask for it, would include LiDAR, aerophotos, and anybody that knows me knows I'm a fan of the European Space Agency Sentinel satellite program. I don't know if you know about that, but it's basically designed to be the next step after Landsat. So Landsat's at 30 meters. This is at 10 meters, so it's 9 times sharper. And the advantage of Landsat and Sentinel are that they're multispectral. So you can take vegetation and wetness indices. You can do color infrared. You can play around with all the 8 or 9 spectra they have and pull things out of vegetation cover that you can't answer with basic aerial photography. So I would assume it would involve aerial, satellite, and LiDAR in terms of remote sensing.
How's the horse population doing?
As good as ever. Thanks for expressing concern. Yeah.
Might be confused on what my concern is. But,
No, I take your meaning. It bounces around, you know. It hits the wildlife people. Dave Blodgett will tell you they think he kind of bounces around you buy the notion of carrying capacity up around 20,000 down to 10, depending on the year. Heavy winters hurt them bad. A lot of foals die. A lot of horses die. But they increase at a rate of about 20% a year in good years, which is dry years for them, right? When there's no heavy snow. And the trapping effort, which is the main mode of control, varies with the price of horse meat. So that's random too. No one's going to take their trailer and drive it and beat up all their equipment and do the dangerous hard work of rounding up wild horses unless it pays. So that's a limit on it too. So it's really the same. The dominant, probably stepping a little bit out of my lane, but the last I checked in with the wildlife program, and I talked to you quite a bit, the main focus for horse issues is using fencing on a large scale to preserve areas that so far are in decent shape, preserve range areas. It's a rangeland issue, right? So there are areas in the East-Satis range there, which is everything to the right of the highway. It goes all the way up to the Horseheaven Hills that are in excellent condition. They're a little higher, a little moister. They're beautiful, beautiful sagebrush steppe. And those are the areas that they're focused on keeping the horses out of, because otherwise it's an impossible job to right now to deal with, to do other things, unfortunately. So.
Were the white alders a native species?
Yes. They're very prevalent in the gorge. They span down to California. I don't know if this is close to their northern limit. It may be. They're not common in other places in the Yakama Basin. Mostly you see red and mountain alder. Yeah. But one of the interesting things is if you look at the JLO surveys, even in places like Yakama and Natchez Rivers, they used to be a lot more prevalent. Red alder did probably, just because it was wetter. You know, the floodplains had more water, and so they like that. White alder's looks different. It grows in drier situations. So very common in California.
Unless there's any more burning questions about Mid-Satus, about time to break for lunch, and we have food here, I believe, arrived. So just, one last call for anything else before we break for lunch.
You're not looking at sediment transport at all, are you? It's just purely vegetation?
We're not going to do sediment transport modeling. The sediment relationships with vegetation would be noted. So I expect that if you do transects, normally you would record the surface substrate, cobble, sand, or whatever. But not Satis it looks like a balanced system to look at it. It doesn't have overwhelming amounts of sediment, and it doesn't look like it has too little sediment. So it'd be an interesting question for Fish Habitat for sure. But I don't think we're getting, it's expensive.
Yeah.
It's expensive to really take a hard look at sediment. So I don't think that's really a big part of it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Great presentation. I'm going to check on the lunch situation, but we'll be breaking till I believe 12:35. I don't have the agenda right in front of me. And everybody on